Hi, guys. Welcome to Office Hours Politics Edition. I'm your host, Sienna Ali, and today we are talking about when the Arab world was once united, Pan-Arabism and Nasserism, and specifically why Western governments often treated these movements as a strategic threat and what kind of actions were taken to contain or redirect the projects. I firstly want to start by saying when I talk about Western state institutions, I'm talking about governments, foreign policy, establishments, intelligence networks, financial power, alliance systems, especially during the Cold War. And also to kind of hone in on what I mean by a threat in geopolitics doesn't mean a threat to human life, not necessarily, but it can mean and more often does mean a threat to access to resources, military positioning, economic arrangements, and the ability to shape outcomes in another region, which the US loves to do. So in this episode, we're going to talk about how a unity project became perceived as a threat. And one more thing before we start. Pan-Arabism is constantly treated like a dead idea, like the only relevance is its nostalgia or aesthetics. But the deeper truth is ideas don't die when they fail. They mutate, they go underground, and they resurface under new names. Here is the roadmap for the episode. We're going to be talking about what Pan-Arabism really meant beyond slogans, the world it emerged from, Nasserism as a state project, why this became a threat to Western power, the tools used to contain it, the internal contradictions, and what remains alive today. Okay, so Pan-Arabism at its core is a political idea that says there exists an Arab political space, not just cultural, but political, linked by language, history, shared struggles, and overlapping economic interests. And because this space was created under imperial arrangements, true independence requires coordination and sometimes unity. Now, what Pan-Arabism was not, I'm saying this because it is often misconstrued or misrepresented, it was not inherently hatred of the West, rejection of quote-unquote modernity, or a desire to erase local identities. Different Pan-Arabists argue different things. Some were secular, some were religious, some were socialists, some were conservative nationalists. But they all kind of agreed around a basic claim. Fragmentation weakens you, unity strengthens you. And politically, that's a big deal because unity isn't just a feeling. It's a change in bargaining power. A single small state negotiation with a superpower is one thing, but a coordinated bloc negotiating is another. So already you can see why foreign policy establishments might get nervous, not because unity is immoral, maybe to the West it is, but because unity changes the leverage. We can look at Pan-Arabism on a deeper level and say Pan-Arabism is best understood as a response to a specific political condition. Sovereignty without control. And that condition looks like you have a flag and a government, but your economy is shaped elsewhere. Your security is dependent on external powers. Your resources are extracted under unfavorable terms. And your borders were drawn to prevent coordination. And that is not a conspiracy statement. That is literally how a lot of colonial and mandate systems operate historically. So Pan-Arabism became a claim to real independence, not just symbolic independence. Now let's talk about the world Pan-Arabism enters. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed and European powers expanded their influence across the region. Borders are formalized, new states emerge under conditions where local elites often rely on outside backing, economies are tied to global markets on unequal terms, and strategic geography becomes a constant external interest. Then World War II ends and a new world order forms. Europe declines, the US rises, and the Soviet Union rises. And the Cold War becomes the organizing logic for almost everything. Now, the Cold War wasn't just about capitalism versus communism. It was about who gets to decide the future of decolonizing regions. Because decolonization isn't neutral. It changes access to resources, bases and military routes, alliances, and the global economic flow. So when Pan-Arabism says we want a coordinated Arab political future, Western policymakers don't only hear identity, they hear we might lose predictable access, we might lose influence over these governments, we might lose the ability to manage the region state by state. Now, the post-war order treated borders as sacred. And Pan-Arabism challenged that sacredity, even peacefully, even rhetorically. And anytime you challenge border legitimacy, especially borders tied to formal imperial states, they get anxious because borders are how states reproduce themselves. So Pan-Arabism is not just a foreign policy issue, it is an ideological disruption. Now we get into Nasserism. So Nasser becomes a symbol because he had something many leaders did not, a mass-based and functioning state platform. Nasserism is often summarized as Arab socialism. That's not wrong, but it is a very shallow way of looking at it. Nasserism is a project of political sovereignty, economic sovereignty, narrative sovereignty, and regional coordination. This is where the threat piece really crystallizes itself. Because Nasserism isn't just a speech, it's a government model. It implies that you can build development without being a client state. You can reclaim infrastructure. You can mobilize masses politically. You can refuse alignment with superpowers. And that is what made it contagious. The contagious is a key word in empire and counter-empire politics. Powerful states often fear not a single opponent, but a spread of model. Because if one country successfully asserts control, others may try. The question becomes, could this model scale across the region? Now let's slow down and unpack the Suez Canal, because that is the moment where sovereignty becomes a public performance. When Egypt nationalized the canal, it's not merely taking property, it's doing something symbolically enormous. It's saying we will not accept an international hierarchy where global infrastructure in our territory is controlled by outside powers indefinitely. Here's the careful point. Many Western narratives frame this as reckless, destabilizing, and/or radical. But from another view, it was a classic decolonial claim. Political independence is meaningless without control over strategic economic assets. So why the huge backlash? Because the canal challenged a long-standing imperial expectation. Strategic influence in the global south can be controlled externally for the global good. But whose global good? And that's the deeper moral politics to it. International order is often framed as neutral, but it contains power. Even the idea of stability becomes a political weapon. Stability for whom? For local populations seeking dignity and development? No. For international systems seeking predictability, yeah. The Suez Canal exposed that conflict. Now let's really go into why Pan-Arabism and Nasserism was seen as a threat. I'm going to break this down into 4 different aspects. The first, it threatened the divide and manage architecture. A region of many small states is easier to influence than a coordinated bloc, which we were saying before. And that's not an insult, it's basic bargaining theory. If Pan-Arabism succeeded even partially, it could unify diplomatic positions, coordinate oil and resource policies, make collective security arrangements, set shared development agendas. That reduces external leverage. Number 2, it threatened resource governance norms, not just oil, routes, ports, canals, infrastructure. Pan-Arabism implied resources and infrastructure should primarily serve local development, not external extraction. This conflicts with how global capitalism has historically functioned in many decolonized regions. Number 3, Nasserism offered dignity and modernity without Western alignment. And that is huge. Because Western power isn't only material, it's also symbolic. Who defines progress? Who defines responsible governance? Who defines legitimacy? Nasserism challenged that by saying we define progress ourselves. And last but not least, it threatened Cold War discipline. Non-alignment is often framed as neutrality, but in a bipolar world, non-alignment is refusal to be controlled, and refusal is a threat. These states were behaving in a very predictable manner. They protect interests, they contain risks, they stabilize favorable orders. But when you zoom out, this creates a moral question. If a person's sovereignty is treated as a risk, what does that say about the order? Now we're going to talk about what the West did in categories because it keeps the language analytical. So in the first tool set, they use diplomatic framing and narrative management. This is under discussed. A movement can be weakened if it is framed globally as irrational, extremist, unstable, uniquely authoritarian, incapable of governance. Notice how powerful that framing is. It shapes who gets investment, who gets legitimacy, who gets trusted partner status. The second tool set was economic pressure and incentives. You don't always need tanks. You can create a world where loans become conditional, aid is strategic, trade access is political, and development paths are narrowed. This is how global order disciplines states. Its third tool set was supporting alternative elites and rival projects. That's a big one. When a regional unity project rises, rival visions often get funded and strengthened. Local nationalism over regionalism. Separate bilateral relationships instead of multilateral coordination. Stability first governance models. This doesn't require one single mastermind plan. It's often a convergence of interests. And lastly, security doctrine and alliance building. Containment often happens through building security partnerships, ensuring military coordination, shaping defense institutions. And this matters because militaries are political actors, not just neutral institutions. And due to these employment of tools, the movement loses oxygen economically, diplomatically, and ideologically. Now let's talk about some of the tensions Pan-Arabism faced. And I think it's important to talk about that after we just had that conversation about the toolbox, because you can kind of see what happens when these are applied. So the first tension is unity versus sovereignty. So to unify, states must give up some aspect of autonomy. But many leaders wanted unity rhetorically while preserving control in practice. So you get symbolic unity without deep institutional integration. Secondly, you get mass politics versus political pluralism. Mass mobilization can empower people, but it can also justify centralized control. Some Pan-Arab states built legitimacy through popular projects while also restricting any type of opposition. And that created a vulnerability. If a leader becomes the symbol, the movement rises and falls with that leader. Moving on to development demands money and time. State-led development is expensive and it requires stable revenue, strong institutions, and long-term planning. External pressures, wars, and economic shocks can derail it very, very fast. And lastly, military defeat as a psychological defeat. Military losses. Military losses don't just change borders, they change belief in possibility. Once a project is seen as failed, people begin to abandon it, even if its goals remain valid. So Pan-Arabism didn't die because unity is stupid. It struggled because it collided with a lot of external containment, internal issues, and the brutal realities of state building under pressure. But here is the part that matters now. Even if Pan-Arabism as a formal state project declined, the question it asks are still everywhere. Why are borders treated as sacred if they are historically imposed? Why is sovereignty praised in theory but punished in practice? Why is economic independence framed as dangerous? Why is regional unity treated like a threat? And if you look around today, you will still see people reaching for shared identity, shared struggle, and shared destiny, even if they don't call it Pan-Arabism. Because the emotional core of Pan-Arabism wasn't propaganda. It was a demand for dignity in a world that often commodifies entire regions. And I'll end this with a question for the comments. If unity is treated as a threat, then what does that tell us about the order that fears it? That is it for today. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode. I will see you guys next week. Until next time, stay curious, stay politically aware, and stay uncompromising with your questions. Bye, guys.